My brother and I are the only ones who have anything to lose, I said to myself. He will be forced to give up the Italian throne. My children will no longer be heirs to the crown of France, but this sacrifice is one that is worthwhile making. Mother will be happier. Her career is over. At least let us hope that her life may not be shortened by her suffering. If only she could cease to care for the man who's hurting her. Let us forget all those splendid promises the future held for us and think only of ensuring our mother's peace of mind. This was how things stood when we returned to Paris. One morning, the emperor sent for me. I was out at the time, and when I came in, he was at a cabinet meeting. I went in to see my mother and found her crying. She told me that the emperor had at last informed her he could no longer live as he was doing, that he had decided to divorce her. Well, all the better, I replied quickly. We shall all leave the court, and you can lead a quieter life. But what will become of you, my children? We shall go with you. My brother agrees with me. For the first time in our life, far from the crowd, we can really know what it means to be happy. This way of looking at things and these plans I made for the future in order to give her something with which to occupy her mind seemed to calm her feelings. When I left her, she seemed resigned to her fate. That evening at dinner, a page brought me word that the emperor wished to see me. I went to him as determined as I had been in the morning not to display the least sign of weakness. A sort of pride seemed to strengthen my will. The emperor stepped out of his study. His manner at first was abrupt. Later, it became more animated. He said to me, "You have seen your mother. She has told you what has happened. My decision has been made. It is irrevocable. All France wishes me to secure a divorce. It demands this loudly. I cannot oppose my country's will. Therefore, nothing will make me change my mind, neither prayers nor tears." "Sire," I replied in a calm, icy tone, "you are free to behave as you please. No one will seek to thwart you. Since your happiness makes this step necessary, that is enough. We shall know how to sacrifice ourselves on your behalf. Do not be surprised if my mother weeps. Indeed, it would be more surprising if she did not do so, after 15 years of married life. But she will submit to your will. We shall all leave your court remembering only the kindness that you have shown us." While I spoke, his face and expression changed. Hardly had I finished when abundant tears started from his eyes, and it was in a voice broken by sobs that he exclaimed, "What? Are you all leaving me? You'll desert me? Don't you love me anymore? Is it not to ensure my happiness, but that of France, that I am acting as I am? You ought to pity me for being obliged to sacrifice my most cherished affections." At the sight of this emotion, which I felt was sincere, I was also touched. I was conscious only that he was unhappy. My pride gave way. I also wept, and my only thought was how I could console him. "Be brave, sire," I said. "We shall need courage ourselves at the thought of no longer being your children. But I assure you we shall know how to be brave. We shall understand that in leaving you, we are removing an obstacle that stands in the way of your plans and hopes." For a long time, he protested against the idea of our departure, assuring me again that his actions were entirely based on political grounds, that my mother would continue to be his dearest friend, that he would not cease to consider my brother as his son, but that not being Eugene's father, he could not make him his heir. He said that only one way of assuring peace for France was to leave his throne to his own child. He had realized this some time ago, and only his affection for his wife had prevented him from asking her for a divorce before. "Do not believe," he said, "that court intrigues could influence me in any way. On the contrary, at the time of the coronation, when I felt that there was a party hostile to your mother, not only did I cause her to be crowned, but I also had her anointed. At that time, I hoped that by presenting my nephews as my heirs, I should satisfy public opinion. But the men I had made powerful insisted that dynastic stability must be assured, and the common people to whom I feel I am indebted believe that I am only the protector of their safety and happiness. After me, anarchy will break out again, and France will lose the fruit of all she has worked so hard to obtain. Instead of that, if I leave a son brought up in accordance with my ideals, a son whom France will have formed the habit of considering as my heir, the country will be able to enjoy what I have done for her, and at least she will benefit by my efforts on her behalf. I shall have borne the pain. Others will reap the reward. As for you, your children's interests, which are what a mother should always consider first, ought to keep you here with me. Therefore, I will not listen to any talk of your going away. Sire, my duty is to be with my mother. She will need me. We can no longer live near you. That is a sacrifice we must make. We are prepared to make it. I returned to report to my mother the conversation that had taken place. Every day brought new conflicts. I persuaded her to let us leave everything behind and follow her. But the emperor afterwards undid all my work. Frequently, my heart bled at the thought of leaving my children. I had hoped to be allowed to keep them with me until they were at least 7 years old. And my imagination already pictured all the compensations for my sacrifice which the intervening years might contain. I dreamed of a possible refuge far from court, the humble pleasures of a family life which would afford my mother the rest she had long desired. There at least I should be able to console myself. Freedom from all anxiety would be my compensation for the sacrifice we had made. I was less clear about my brother's future. Knowing his character, I could guess what his own conduct would be. But would his wife, brought up as she had been close to a throne, agree to renounce her position as willingly? Would she not feel too keenly the loss of those high hopes which she had held for the future? The emperor sent Eugène word by telegraph to come to Paris. It was the first time he had been back to France since the day when, as the colonel of the guard, he left it at the head of his regiment. I went to meet him to inform him of the reason for his trip. Our carriages met at Nemours. He left his carriage and came over to sit in mine. After we had embraced each other, weeping with joy as we did so, he said to me, "Is the reason for my return pleasant or unpleasant?" I answered, "Unpleasant," and he guessed the rest. His first words were, "Has my mother courage to face it?" "Yes." "Very well, we shall all leave quietly and end our days more simply than we began them." "But why did they make me marry a princess? My poor wife is the only one to be pitied. She has hoped that her children would wear crowns. She has been brought up to consider that important. She thinks that I have been sent for to be named heir to the throne of France. But she will be brave. She loves me so dearly, and she is so fine, and she must know that if you do right, you can never be unhappy." While we were traveling back together, I told him everything about what had happened in Paris, which I thought might be of interest to him. I had once more found a protector, a friend, and forgetting for a moment the unpleasant cause of his presence, I gave myself the joy of unbosoming myself of all of my troubles. He knew a good deal already, but when he found me so altered in my appearance, he guessed the rest and realized the intensity of my sufferings. He admitted to me that he would have difficulty in recognizing me. Eugène told me of the charm that enveloped his own home life, of that perpetual atmosphere of harmony which was a refuge for him after all of his labors. How different our fates had been. All good fortune seemed to have been allotted to him, yet his good fortune became all the dearer to me, for I felt that in a way my own suffering had to some degree made it possible. Far from complaining of what had befallen me, I prayed heaven to continue to send me all the misfortunes of life and to spare my brother. We arrived at the Tuileries. Eugène immediately went up to see the emperor, and I returned to the empress. The latter was so deeply moved at the thought of meeting her son again, whom she had not seen since they had met in Munich. She had never doubted that either he or my children would succeed the emperor, and all these hopes had suddenly vanished. She grieved solely on our account, for, as far as she was concerned, her mind was already made up. She kept constantly before her those ideas that strengthened her decision. She would remain the friend of the man she loved. She would continue to live in the same country that he did. Her own existence would be simpler. Above all, the knowledge that she was doing her share to ensure the happiness of France and of the emperor. She was determined not to live far away from him, and she waited anxiously to know my brother's opinion on this point, which she feared might be the same as mine. The emperor and Eugène joined us, coming down by the private stairway. Our meeting was a painful one. All eyes overflowed with tears. Even the man who, when I had seen him, was absolutely decided, seemed ready to change the resolutions he had formed. But my brother and I assured him the time for that was past. Now that we knew what was in his mind, the Empress could no longer be happy with him. We had not taken any action so long as we considered the matter merely a court intrigue or a family cabal, but now that he has explained all to us, we felt obliged to leave him. The Emperor repeated to my brother what he had already said to me. He wished everything to take place amicably. The Empress should not lose either her position or the respect he had for her. My brother insisted that the separation be a complete one. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in an ambiguous position, he said. In the end, my mother might prove to be in your way. People would dare attack our family thinking we'd been dismissed from court. Our simplest actions would be considered prearranged plans. Even your enemies would hurt our cause by passing themselves off as our defenders and lead you to suspect us unjustly. It is better to leave nothing behind. Tell us a spot where, far from the court and its intrigues, we can help our mother bear the weight of her misfortune. The Emperor protested against the poor opinion we seemed to have of him, and said, speaking in a serious, thoughtful way that showed he was deeply moved, Eugène, if ever I have been useful to you in your career, if ever you have looked upon me as a father, do not abandon me. I need you. Your sister cannot leave me either. She owes that to her children, who are my nephews. Nor does your mother wish you both to go away. With all your exaggerated ideas, you will increase her unhappiness. Indeed, I may say more. You should remember the verdict that history will pass on your mother. You must remain with me unless you wish it to be said. The Empress was repudiated, abandoned, and perhaps deserved such treatment. It is not her attitude, a far nobler one, if she continues to live near me, to keep her rank and her position, to prove by doing so that our separation was due entirely to political necessities, and one to which she consented. She will thereby deserve more than ever the praise, love, and respect of the nation for whose good she sacrificed herself. We did not know how to reply to these new arguments, as powerful as they were unexpected. We were won over by the Emperor's solicitude for his wife's reputation at the very moment he was leaving her. The attitude of the children towards their mother had to be the same as that of the husband toward the wife. They would have done wrong not to follow his example. Instead of seeking to oppose the Emperor's wish that we stay at court, we were prepared to agree to it, since by doing so we assured our mother so many advantages, a quiet life as she liked, an opportunity to satisfy her own tastes, and a noble and worthy memory in the minds of all. Our desires were subordinated to her interests. Already we prepared to accept our new position, which placed us on an equal footing with the crowd that had before been at our feet, and made us nobodies still living on amid the same surroundings where they had formerly been all-powerful. Once the sacrifice had been resolved upon, the only thing left was to carry it out. The Emperor's family met to hear what had been decided. Their joy was apparent in spite of their efforts to conceal it. Although pretending to be touched by what was happening to the Empress, every time they turned to us, of whom they had always been jealous, they betrayed their true feelings by their satisfied and triumphant manner. It seems I was always obliged to face several troubles simultaneously. Now I heard that my husband had come back. The Emperor, doubtless with a view of bringing about a reconciliation between Louis and myself, had urged me to write the king about what was going on. I did so. In reply, I received a long review of all the misfortunes of which I had been the cause, ending by the expression of a wish, which he considered was probably in keeping with my own desires, that we secure a judicial separation. After a lunch which the Princess Pauline gave for the Emperor at Neuilly, the Emperor called me over to him, and while the guests were all in the garden, slipped his arm through mine and led me a little away from the rest of the people, saying as he did so, "Your husband arrives tomorrow. I know he intends to live at his mother's house. I do not approve of that. Here in France, I have the right to oblige him to go to his own house, but I know how unhappy his disagreeable character makes you. Tell me, would you feel badly if I ordered him to go to your home?" "Sire," I exclaimed, "I lack the courage to bear this continually renewed suffering." Yet, he replied, Louis is kind. It is true nobody can live with him. But that is because your gentle nature does not sufficiently curb his faults. Yet, he replied, Louis is kind. It is true nobody can live with him. But that is because your gentle nature does not curb his faults. An honest woman should always rule her husband. Sire, I beseech you, let him do as he wishes. The emperor appeared undecided. We rejoined the rest of the party, and as a matter of fact, my husband, instead of returning to his palace, went to his mother's house. I admit, in spite of all the malicious gossip this caused, I congratulated myself that he had done so. So much did his presence alarm me. Our not living together was the first indication the public had that we were not a devoted couple. The children always spent their evenings with their father. The youngest one, who had not been well for several days, was not able to go out. My husband lost his temper and declared openly that I wished to prevent his seeing his little boy. He came alone in the evening to see the baby in his bed in order to convince himself that his son was really ill. Between married people who are unhappy together, everything becomes a reason for quarrels and discussions. The emperor had insisted that my husband make me a formal visit, and I returned his call. We occasionally met at the Tuileries, and as I have heard since, he said that he found me so altered in appearance that he felt sorry for me. The king fell ill. I went to see him and entered without being announced, anxious to obtain news of his health. The next day when I went back, he refused to receive me. I was much upset. At last, in response to between married people who are unhappy together, everything becomes a reason for quarrels and discussions. The emperor had insisted that my husband make me a formal visit, and I returned his call. We occasionally met at the Tuileries, and as I've heard since, he said that he found me so altered in appearance that he felt sorry for me. The king fell ill. I went to see him and entered without being announced, anxious to obtain news of his health. The next day when I went back, he refused to receive me. I was much upset. At last, in response to our repeated demands, the emperor called a family council to pass on the question of our separation. Neither side was able to present any serious grounds, and the emperor said several times, "They are children. There isn't as much as a sheet of paper between them. They must make up their quarrel." During this period, many fetes were being held in Paris to celebrate the peace with Austria. Everyone was aware that the emperor's divorce was about to take place, but in accordance with her usual line of conduct, the emperor attended all the receptions wearing the imperial crown, although convinced that in a short time it would be worn by another. At this time, and up to the moment of the divorce, the kings of Saxony and Württemberg and of Bavaria were in Paris. The empress received them. My brother had gone to meet the king of Bavaria to inform him of the separation. The king was deeply affected by the news. He regretted his arrival just at this time, which made it seem as though he had come to act as a witness. He wished some definite arrangement to be made as regard the voice. During this period, many fetes were being held in Paris to celebrate the peace with Austria. Everyone is aware that the emperor's divorce was about to take place, but in accordance with her usual line of conduct, the empress attended all the receptions wearing the imperial crown, although convinced that in a short time it would be worn by another. At this time, I can't do this. Between married people who are unhappy together, everything becomes a reason for quarrels and discussions. The emperor had insisted that my husband make me a formal visit, and I returned his call. We occasionally met at the Tuileries, and as I have heard since, he said that he found me so altered in appearance that he felt sorry for me. The king fell ill. I went to see him and entered without being announced, anxious to obtain news of his health. The next day when I went back, he refused to receive me. I was much upset. At last, in response to our repeated demands, the emperor called the family council to pass on the question of our separation. Neither side was able to present any serious grounds, and the emperor said several times, "They are children. There isn't as much as a sheet of paper between them. They must make up their quarrel." During this period, many fetes were being held in Paris to celebrate the peace with Austria. Everyone is aware that the emperor's divorce is about to take place, but in accordance with her usual line of conduct, the empress attended all the receptions wearing the imperial crown, although convinced that in a short time it would be worn by another. At this time, and up to the moment of the divorce, the kings of Saxony, Württemberg, and of Bavaria were in Paris. The empress received them. My brother had gone to meet the king of Bavaria to inform him of the separation. The king was deeply affected by the news. He regretted his arrival just at that time, which made it seem as though he had come to act as a witness. He wished for some definite arrangement to be made as regard to the viceroy's future. The emperor was quite agreeable to the idea and proposed to my brother a kingdom made up of the Illyrian provinces, the Tyrol, or any other region he preferred. My brother always replied, "I'm asking for nothing at all. Do not trouble about me." The empress also insisted that something be done about her son, as his title of Prince of Venice did not assure him the Italian crown, which belonged by law to the emperor's second son. But the viceroy was positive in his attitude that he was not prepared to accept a throne or any other advantage that would seem to have been a ransom for his mother's misfortune. Finally, on December 15th, 1809, the day of the divorce, all the family assembled in the emperor's principal study, where he had been alone with the empress. Each took his place in accordance with his rank. The High Chancellor and Count Regnault de la Saint-Gelais came in, and both remained standing. The emperor took up a piece of paper and began to read in a clear and steady voice. When, however, he came to the phrase, "She has made my life more beautiful for 15 years," his emotion was evident. The empress then read her statement. Tears prevented her from completing it. She handed it to Count Regnault, who finished it, although he too was weeping. The official report of the proceeding. I lost my spot. I told us it's not. Oh, let's go again. Finally, on December 15th, 1809, the day of the divorce, all the family assembled in the emperor's principal study, where he had been alone with the empress. Each took his place in accordance with his rank. The High Chancellor and Count Regnault de la Saint-Gelais came in, and both remained standing. The emperor took up a piece of paper and began to read in a clear and steady voice. When, however, he came to the phrase, "She has made my life more beautiful for 15 years," his emotion was evident. The empress then read her statement. Tears prevented her from completing it. She handed it to Count Regnault, who finished it, although he too was weeping. The official report of the proceeding had been drawn up and signed by all those present. The emperor embraced the empress and led her to her apartment. A little later, he came to fetch me and took me to her. I found her exhausted and overcome with the strain she had been under. I felt it was necessary to keep up her courage to the end. In order to do so, I reminded her of the misfortunes of that other queen who had preceded her in this same palace and how left it only to mount the scaffold. I pointed out how much more fortunate she was and dwelt on the consolations that still remained to her. Finally, her courage seemed to revive. On the preceding day, my brother had gone to the Senate to announce the divorce and declare that it took place with our consent. The next morning, early, I went to see my mother. Her drawing room was filled with ladies in waiting, weeping over her departure. I feared the effect this emotion would produce on her, although I felt that the worst was already over. To leave a court is not the same as leaving a place where you've been happy. I led my mother to her carriage while the emperor was attending his cabinet meeting. He had already said goodbye to her. I was not present when he did so, but I can imagine how heartrending it must have been.